Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about a little bit of news around the ACC and Clemson. There's been a new twist to a case that has had about every twist and turn you could possibly think of, but definitely a very, very interesting thing that we will follow very closely. But let's talk about bowl games, and let's talk about hopefully that not being a thing where players opt out all the time. So one of the biggest things that I've noticed over the last couple of years with college football fans is players sitting out bowl games is just not something we want to see. I think that's something everyone agrees with, to be totally honest with you. We want to see the best players on the field. We want to see some of the players that are playing the last game as a, Texas Longhorn, as a Michigan Wolverine, as a Kansas Jayhawk. It doesn't matter. We just want to see our favorite players on the field one last time suit up for our favorite teams, right? So it's one of those things that we've been trying to fight against, and there was no real great solution necessarily under the current form of things, just because there's not a lot of structure around a lot of things that need some structure. But it sounds like something is trying to come to our aid, and it's the new NIL structure that is being discussed around college football. We talked about it earlier this week, where they're getting into kind of a revenue sharing contract type model when it comes to paying athletes. And I think it's something that probably should have happened quite a long time ago, to be totally honest with you, just because this was always going to come. This was always going to be the reality of college sports at some point, and we've just been a couple of years behind and playing a little bit of catch up because the NCAA just was not ready. Let's just be totally honest with each other. But one of the interesting things is the Bull Season executive director, Nick Capilari, had a very, very interesting quote where he was talking about kind of what the future of NIL would look like. And it would be bringing NIL collectives, which usually were, alumni run and technically separate from the school, although they would work with the athletic department, just didn't have, a direct affiliation with the school. They would bring those in-house, which I think is a huge step forward for NIL, partly because it would just make everything more transparent. Some of this stuff would just have to be public record because it is a public university. In the majority of these cases, obviously, it is a public university, so some of this would just have to be out there for everyone to see. So I think it's a really, really interesting thought, and it's something that I think all of us can get on board with. When we have all of these players who are in college sports for some time where it is an amateurized model, so you can't have guys, nailed down by specific contracts that they absolutely have to follow. That's just not something that is in the cards. But if you're going to start cutting them in on media deals, if you're going to start cutting them in on, getting a more regular type of payment than NIL deals and endorsement deals, then you can, demand some things of them, and that just is kind of the way of things, and it's the way that college sports have been going, and this is definitely a pro in my eyes. I think one of the things that Capillary said during his conversation was, in this case, talking about what stipulations they would have to follow with contracts and what stipulations everyone has to follow when they sign a contract for a particular job. He said, in this case, play 12 regular season games and a bowl game, or a bowl game and a playoff. That's logical to expect. It's the way the rest of us work and working folks operate, excuse me. So essentially, he's just saying this is, jobs. This is the reality of any profession, whether it's, professional sports, which is what this is now, or, being a dentist or being a doctor, or it doesn't matter. You have certain things that you have to fulfill. And it's something that college football has been missing for quite some time, because you can't really enforce anything when there's no structure to the thing that you're trying to enforce, right? So I think this is a huge step forward. It's something that absolutely needs to happen, and one of the things, you hope will happen because of this. We talked about how transparency in NIL is so important, so hopefully that is a huge part of what comes, but also cohesive rules across different conferences, across different schools, because you don't want a reality where people are kind of fighting for who has the most lenient or who has the most player friendly rules, because that would be really bad for just the reality of college football, and that would be really bad for just the confusion that fans would feel on a daily basis, and you would lose a lot of people that definitely love the sport right now, but are kind of holding on by a little bit of a thread. But just to give you an idea of how big of an issue this opt-out thing is, some people say it's not as big of an issue as some people think. Others say it's, the sky is falling type of issue, but it's somewhere in the middle. But to be fair, they estimate that there are about 8 players per team that opt out on average every single year, which is just a pretty insane number. And to be totally honest, I think a good portion of that, not necessarily the entire thing, obviously, but I do think a portion of that has to do with the current structure of the transfer portal and everything that happens in the month of December, where someone like, let's just say, Malik Murphy is a good example of this at Texas, who they were going to a playoff game. He was going to be the backup quarterback in that playoff game, but every quarterback was finding their way somewhere else. He was essentially losing seconds and losing money and losing ability to find a good place to play every second that he stayed at Texas. So he was essentially forced to leave before he was ready, before he wanted to, before that playoff game that he absolutely deserved to be a part of, because this is the reality of college football. You have to put your name in the ring, because if you don't, you're going to have a problem. You're going to, either not find the right place to play, not find a good place for you to develop. Whatever it is, it's going to cause problems for you. So some of this needs to be fixed by the calendar just being common sense. I think the transfer portal period should come after the national title game. I don't think there should be any, blowback on that by any means. Players can, plan their futures during that time. They can't obviously talk to other teams. That's a totally other issue that we need to deal with in college football. But they need to set up a structure to where we're not plopping something that is hugely important to the sport right now in the middle of the most important aspect of the sport when it comes to football, which is the postseason and the new playoff that is kind of rolling through and everything like that. So I think it's something that needs to be fixed somewhat from a calendar perspective, but also it never hurts when you have, a little bit of a monetary value towards playing that final game and pushing yourself into that arena one more time and putting on that jersey one more time. I think it's everything. It's something that everyone can get behind for sure. But one of the things that really pushed this forward and made everyone see this as not only, a slight issue, but something that needs to be handled pretty much immediately was the Florida State and UGA game a year ago. I think everyone remembers that game very well. Florida State had pretty much every player that was a big-time player for them in 2023 sit out during that game, and it did not go well. It was 63-3. Georgia, you knew they were coming in with a lot of energy after that SEC game loss, and man, they took them to the woodshed. And one of the very interesting things that's happened in the last couple of days that I won't waste a lot of time on, to be totally honest with you, but Keon Coleman was on RG3's podcast talking about it and had the weirdest spin zone for this I think I've ever heard. He essentially blamed it on UGA losing to Bama in the SEC title game for why they didn't get to play a serious game. I've never seen that. Florida State could have showed up. They could have played the game, but they decided not to. I'll leave it at that because that was just a weird clip that I'd rather not, get down a rabbit hole on, to be totally honest with you. So I think with all of this stuff, there's been so much emphasis on these players playing these games. You want to see Keon Coleman out there. You want to see all of these elite players playing one last time for their teams, whether it's they're going on to the NFL, they're going into the transfer portal. These bowl games, in a certain extent, should be kind of an audition, and you don't want it to be, obviously, for some of these players, but if you're a backup player that gets into a game, it's kind of an audition if you're going to go into the portal later in the year, and that's just kind of the way of things right now. So I think it's always a great thing. I think you want as many players on the field as possible. Now, if I'm being totally honest, for me, it was never the biggest problem in the world, and partly because I'm a little bit of a freak when it comes to college football. I know a lot of these players. I know a lot of the, second line and third line players. I pay attention to recruiting very closely. So when I see, the freshman quarterback gets to start or the freshman tight end gets his first run. It's a cool thing for me, but at the end of the day, I am not a normal college football fan, and you need to, cater to some fans that want to see those big time players playing in those big time games, and it would just bring the fun back to bowl season. I remember when I was younger, bowl season was incredible. It was, every game felt like a huge game because it was the last one that you were going to see for a year. And now it feels like if you're not in the playoff, if you're not playing for that big trophy, then what's the point? Which is a crazy way to look at college football, in my opinion, but that's just kind of the way of things right now. So I think there's going to be a ton of movement on NIL and kind of the money structure that goes on in college football, and I think there will be a lot of negotiations. Hopefully some players can be in on those negotiations, which we talked about yesterday with UAB joining a players association, but this is genuinely some really good news. I think this is something that pretty much everyone can get behind, everyone can be excited about, because watching, the opt-outs just pile up every single day has been very, very frustrating. Watching a lot of the energy be put towards opting outs and transfer portal and all of the other things that are going on except for football is really annoying. I'll be totally honest with you. In December, it's one of my more frustrating months because there's such little emphasis on the football games that are being played. Instead, they focus on, where's this kid that just jumped into the portal going to go, in 2 months. So it's a very frustrating thing for, I think, a lot of college football fans. We want to talk about the games. We want to cover the games. We want to see the games. So I think it's something that we've wanted a change very, very imminently, and it looks like it's starting to come. Now, there's still a lot of T's to be crossed and I's to be dotted for sure when it comes to this plan, and they're going to have to get their ducks in a row. But at the end of the day, I do think this will happen, and I do think this will be a huge point for fans and for the NCAA when it comes to these conversations. If this is not in there, I think there will be a lot of fans that will be very upset. But we'll keep track of that as it comes. I think this NIL stuff, changes very quickly, and there's a lot of different movement from here and there. But this is one that I can definitely get behind, and hopefully this comes sooner rather than later, because I would love to see a full bowl season this upcoming year without all the opt-outs and all the transfer portal news and all of that type of stuff. So we'll see what happens. I will definitely keep you updated with how all of this develops, because it's going to be a really interesting thing to watch, and I think something that college football fans would just be counting down the days for. But we're going to take our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about spring overreactions. We did this yesterday, talking about the SEC. We're going to go right back to the SEC today, because I had a ton pop into my head at the end of the day yesterday, so wanted to get those out there for you guys. So stick with us, and we will be right back with that.